The crying started before sunrise. Small, weak, almost swallowed by the sound of heavy rain hammering the roof of an abandoned logging shed deep in the mountain forest. Daniel Hartwell stood just outside the rotting door, flashlight cutting through the dark, rain soaking through his collar. He'd heard sounds like this before, raccoons usually, maybe a fox that had wandered in from the tree line. He pushed the door open anyway. The beam of light swept across wet timber and old rusted tools, and then stopped. 3 tiny faces stared back at him from the corner. Not raccoons. Not anything he expected to find on a Tuesday morning in late October. 3 Pallas's cat cubs, barely the size of his fist each, huddled together against their mother's motionless body, soaked, shaking, their flat, wide faces frozen in something between terror and exhaustion. The mother was gone, had been for hours, from the look of it. Daniel didn't move for a long moment. Then, quietly, from behind him, his old Labrador, Daisy, stepped forward through the mud, ducked her gray muzzle through the doorway, and slowly walked toward those 3 trembling cubs. And what she did next, nobody who heard this story ever quite believed it. Daniel had lived alone on the eastern edge of the Sayan wilderness for going on 11 years now. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that most maps didn't bother marking. 3 rooms, a wood stove, a front porch that needed new boards every spring. He'd built the back fence himself the first winter, he and Margaret, together. Margaret had been gone for 6 years. The kind of gone that doesn't get easier with time, just quieter. His days had settled into something that worked, if not exactly lived. Up before light, coffee on the stove, patrol the eastern ridge, check the trail cameras, report anything unusual to the regional wildlife office, come home. Feed Daisy, sit on the porch until the cold drove him inside. Daisy was 13 now, a yellow Labrador with a white chin and eyes that had seen enough of the world to stay calm through most of it. She moved slower these days. Her hips bothered her on cold mornings. Daniel could tell by the careful way she descended the porch steps, testing each one before committing. But she still followed him everywhere, every patrol, every morning. Like she understood that keeping him company was the most important job she had left. The cabin was quiet in the way that houses get when only one person lives in them for too long. That was the word Daniel would use later, when he tried to explain how he felt those years. Quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. He hadn't planned on stopping at the logging shed that morning. It wasn't on his usual route, but Daisy had pulled toward it, steady and certain, the way she sometimes did when she sensed something he couldn't yet. He'd learned to follow her instincts a long time ago. Now he stood inside the shed, looking at 3 cubs that weighed maybe 4 ounces each, shivering against a mother who would never warm them again. Pallas's cats weren't common here, reclusive, rarely seen, almost never found this close to human territory. For the mother to have come this far into the shed, she must have been in serious trouble long before the rain started. Daniel pulled out his radio and called it in. The wildlife team's response was careful, professional, and honest. Survival odds for unweaned Pallas's cat cubs without a mother were extremely low. The team would try to arrange transport, but the nearest facility was hours away. Through this weather it might be morning before anyone could get out. He looked at the 3 cubs. They were crying again. That thin, reedy sound, like something trying very hard to exist. Were Nimbutsumendihauf. He unbuttoned his outer jacket, lined the inside with it, and gently, very gently, placed all 3 cubs against his chest. Daisy watched him the entire time. Back at the cabin, Daniel set up the warmest corner near the wood stove. He found a clean crate, an old wool blanket, and a heating pad buried in the hall closet from when Daisy had her own surgery 2 winters back. He warmed some water, mixed in the emergency colostrum supplement he kept in the first aid kit, more out of habit than hope, and tried, quietly and carefully, to get each cub to take even a few drops. They were too weak, too frightened, too lost without the scent and warmth they needed. He sat back on his heels, watching them tremble together in the crate. He didn't hear Daisy approach. He just noticed suddenly that she was already beside the crate, nosing the edge of it, huffing softly at the cubs inside. And then, without any encouragement, without any command, she stepped in beside them, turned once, and lay down with her body curved around all 3. The cubs stopped crying within 60 seconds, not because they understood what she was, not because anything had been solved, but because something warm had stayed. Daniel sat on the floor of his own cabin in the middle of the night, with rain still hitting the roof, and watched his 13-year-old Labrador mother 3 wild cats that had no right to be alive. He didn't know what to call what he was feeling. He hadn't felt it in a long time. The wildlife team arrived the following afternoon. They examined the cubs carefully, dehydrated, underweight, but alive, warmer than expected, calmer than they had any reason to be. One of the researchers, a younger woman named Irina who'd worked Pallas's cat conservation for years, crouched beside Daisy for a long moment without speaking. Then she looked up at Daniel. "How long has she been doing this?" "Since last night," he said. Irina shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, in something closer to reverence. She told Daniel the cubs would need round-the-clock care, that releasing them to a facility was still the safest option, that even with everything Daisy was doing, the odds were still not good. Daniel nodded, said he understood. Then he asked if they could give it one more week. That night, long after Irina had left, Daniel sat in the old wooden chair beside the stove and watched Daisy sleeping with the cubs pressed against her chest. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The forest was completely still. And for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, the cabin didn't feel quiet anymore. Then, just before he turned off the light to sleep, Daisy's head lifted from the floor. Her ears came forward. A low sound rose in her chest, not barking, something older than that. She was growling at the front door. And beyond the dark window glass, in the tree line just past the porch, something enormous was standing perfectly still, watching the cabin. Daniel didn't sleep the rest of that night. He sat in the chair by the wood stove with his flashlight across his knees, listening. Daisy had stopped growling after a few minutes, but she didn't lie back down. She stayed near the door, nose working steadily at the gap beneath it, reading whatever language the cold air carried in from outside. The cubs slept through all of it. That, somehow, made it worse. First light came slow and gray. Daniel pulled on his boots, his jacket, and stepped outside onto the frost-covered porch before the coffee had finished brewing. The tracks were easy to find. They circled the cabin in a wide, deliberate loop, starting at the tree line, moving along the east fence, passing within 20 feet of the front door, then disappearing back into the forest the way they came. He crouched beside the clearest print and studied it for a long moment. Not wolf, not bear. The pad was wide and round, the claw marks shallow, the stride long and unhurried. He photographed it and sent it to Irina before breakfast. Her reply came back in under 10 minutes. "That's a male manul, large one. The track size suggests an adult in his prime." She paused in her message, then added, "Daniel, it's possible he's the father." Daniel stood at the kitchen window for a while after reading that, coffee going cold in his hand, watching the tree line. He thought about what it meant, a wild male circling the cabin in the dark, drawn by scent, by sound, by something instinctual and ancient that didn't care about cabin walls or wool blankets or an old Labrador standing guard. He thought about what the cubs were, not pets, never pets. Wild animals who happened to be alive right now because of a rainstorm and a dog's instinct and a man who hadn't been able to walk away. He knew, in that quiet, honest part of himself, what the future likely held. He just wasn't ready to name it yet. The weeks that followed were nothing like Daniel expected. He had braced for struggle, constant feedings, weak cubs, setbacks, and at first there were plenty of those. But somewhere around the 3rd week, something shifted. The cubs began eating on their own. Their coats thickened. The trembling stopped, and their personalities arrived, suddenly and completely, like they'd been waiting for the right moment to unpack. The largest cub, a male, had no fear of anything. He was the first to explore past the crate, the first to investigate Daisy's water bowl, the first to attempt climbing the woodpile beside the stove. Daniel started calling him Boulder, quietly, when no one was listening. The smallest, another male, was the opposite, watchful, careful. He observed everything from a distance before approaching, cataloging the world with those flat, serious eyes. Irina, when she visited for a follow-up, said she'd never seen a Pallas's cat study a room quite like that. The 3rd cub, the only female, had no interest in the room at all. She was only interested in Daisy. From the first week she had claimed the old Labrador completely. She slept pressed against Daisy's neck. She batted at Daisy's ears with soft paws when she wanted attention. She followed 2 steps behind the dog through every room, so consistently that Daniel began watching his footing near doorways just to avoid stepping on her. He didn't name her. He couldn't bring himself to. because naming her felt like holding on too tight to something that was never fully his to hold. Daisy, for her part, accepted all three of them with a patience that went beyond training or instinct. She cleaned them every morning. Not gently, thoroughly, in the efficient maternal way that made the cubs squirm and pin their ears back, which she ignored entirely. She carried the smallest one back to the warmth of the stove at least twice a day when he wandered too far and lost his confidence. When they cried in the night, she was up before Daniel heard a sound. Wildlife researchers who visited during those weeks kept using a specific word when they watched her: devoted. One older biologist, a man who'd spent 30 years studying predator behavior across 3 continents, stood quietly for a long time watching Daisy clean the female cub's face by the morning window. Then he turned to Daniel and said, in a voice that was almost private, "I've seen maternal adoption across species before. I've never seen it look quite like this." Daniel nodded. He didn't have words for it either. By late winter, the cabin had transformed in ways he couldn't have predicted. There were tiny paw prints on the kitchen windowsill every morning. Someone, almost certainly Boulder, had discovered that the gap behind the refrigerator was a perfect ambush position and used it against both of the other cubs with tremendous consistency. The smallest one had developed a habit of sitting on top of Daniel's boots whenever he set them by the door, which made mornings complicated. Daniel found himself laughing at things again. Small things, quiet things. A cub appearing suddenly from inside a cabinet he could have sworn he'd closed. Daisy's expression of profound suffering when all 3 climbed onto her simultaneously. The elaborate stalking routine the female performed before ambushing a pine cone that had rolled through the open door. He called them his fluffy little criminals one evening without thinking, and then sat with the phrase for a moment, surprised by himself. It had been a long time since he'd made a joke to an empty room and actually meant it, but underneath all of it, something quieter was happening. He noticed it first on a morning in early March. Daisy had always been the first one up, always at the door when he reached for his boots, always ready. That morning she was still on her bed when he came out of the bedroom. She lifted her head when she heard him. Her tail moved twice against the blanket, but she didn't get up right away. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment, and something cold and familiar moved through his chest. He'd seen that before, in Margaret near the end, that particular kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. He told himself it was just the cold snap, that her joints were bothering her, that 13 was old but not impossible for a Labrador who'd been well cared for. He told himself a lot of things that morning while he made his coffee and kept his back to the room. Through April, the cubs began ranging further, not running, exploring, short trips into the forest edge that lasted an hour, then 2, then sometimes most of an afternoon. They always returned by evening, always came back smelling of pine resin and cold creek water and things Daniel couldn't identify. Their movements changed, sharper, more deliberate. The playful chaos of winter gave way to something more focused, more purposeful. He watched them crouch at the forest edge in the early mornings, perfectly still, watching the meadow the way their species had watched open ground for 1,000 generations before barns and cabins ever existed. They were remembering something they'd never been taught. He called Irina one evening and told her what he was observing. She listened carefully. Then she said, "That's exactly what's supposed to happen, Daniel. That's good news." He said he knew. He didn't say what else he was feeling. The storm came on a Thursday evening in late April without much warning, a fast-moving system that dropped the temperature 15 degrees in 2 hours and pushed hard rain sideways against the windows. Daniel counted the cubs before dark. 2 were inside. 1 wasn't. He counted again. Still 2. Daisy was already at the door. They went out together into the rain, Daniel with a flashlight and the long walking stick he kept by the porch, Daisy moving ahead of him with her nose down and her ears forward, reading the ground with everything she had left. The forest was loud with rain. The trail was slick. Twice Daniel caught himself on a low branch, once nearly went down on a root he didn't see. Daisy never hesitated. An hour in, maybe more, she stopped at the edge of a rocky outcrop where the trail dropped sharply toward the creek bed. Daniel heard it before he saw it, a thin, high sound cutting through the rain. He swung the flashlight down. The smallest cub was pressed against the rock face below, cornered on a narrow ledge above the rushing water. And above him on the trail, 2 larger shapes moved in slow, deliberate circles. Mountain cats, young adults likely, scoping an easy target. Everything happened fast after that. Daisy went down the embankment before Daniel could stop her, not running, but moving with a certainty that her body hadn't shown in months. She placed herself between the cub and the cats, and she stood there in the rain, 13 years old and white-chinned and shaking with the effort of it, and she was not afraid. The mountain cats hesitated. Daniel came down the slope making as much noise as he could manage, flashlight sweeping, voice loud, and the cats broke away into the trees. He gathered the cub against his chest, turned back to Daisy. She was standing in the creek bed, sides heaving. When she tried to take a step toward him, her back legs didn't cooperate. She went down slowly, like something that had decided. Daniel was beside her in the mud before she'd fully settled. The drive to the veterinary clinic took 40 minutes on a wet road that felt like it lasted half the night. Daisy lay in the back with her head on the smallest cub, who had refused, with complete Pallas's cat stubbornness, to be put in the crate. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on the rearview mirror the whole drive. At the clinic, he sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights that hummed, and he held his hat in both hands, and he waited. The vet came out just before midnight. She sat down across from him. She spoke carefully, the way good vets learn to speak when the news requires it. And Daniel heard the words he'd been pushing away for months. "Her heart is tired, Daniel. She's compensated beautifully for a long time." A pause. "There's not much time left for her." The drive home from the clinic was quiet, in a way that had weight to it. Daisy lay in the back seat on the old wool blanket Daniel had grabbed on his way out the door. The smallest cub was still pressed against her side, tucked under her chin, rising and falling with her breathing. Daniel had stopped trying to separate them. He drove slowly, no reason to rush. The rain had stopped somewhere during the hours he'd spent in that waiting room, and the road home was dark and clean and empty, just the headlights and the trees and the sound of Daisy breathing behind him. He didn't turn on the radio. Back at the cabin, the other two cubs were waiting at the door. They didn't rush out the way they usually did. They stood back and watched while Daniel carried Daisy inside, and something in their posture was different, quieter, more contained. The fearless one, bolder, who had never shown a moment's hesitation about anything in his short life, stepped aside and let Daniel pass without investigating. Daniel set Daisy down in her bed by the wood stove. She exhaled slowly and let her head rest on the edge of the blanket. Within minutes, all three cubs had arranged themselves around her, not on top of her, the way they sometimes piled on in their careless puppyish way, beside her, close but careful, like they understood, in whatever language their instincts spoke, that something had changed. Daniel built up the fire. Then he sat in the old wooden chair and watched the four of them in the firelight for a long time before he could make himself go to bed. The days that followed moved differently. The cabin, which had spent the better part of 6 months filled with the particular chaos of 3 growing Pallas's cats, overturned boots, ambushed pine cones, the sound of small bodies launching themselves off furniture at unpredictable intervals, went almost completely still. The cubs didn't stop moving entirely. They still ate, still went outside for short periods, still tracked the bird activity near the east window with their usual focused intensity, but the wildness was dialed down to something softer. They stayed close to the wood stove. They stayed close to Daisy. Irina came by on the 4th day and sat with Daniel at the kitchen table over coffee while the cubs rested around Daisy in the next room. She said she'd read studies on animals anticipating loss in companions. She said the behavior wasn't surprising, scientifically. Then she stopped talking science and just sat with him for a while. That meant more than the studies. Daniel started sleeping in the chair. Not every night. He tried the bed, told himself he needed the rest. But he kept waking before light and moving to the chair anyway, pulling the old quilt around his shoulders and sitting with the fire and the sound of Daisy's breathing in the dark. She was still herself, mostly. Her eyes were clear. She acknowledged him when he spoke to her, that steady, ancient Labrador attention that had always made him feel like whatever he was saying mattered. She accepted the cub's presence with the same patient grace she always had, cleaning the female's ears when she climbed close, letting the smallest one use her chest as a pillow without complaint. But she tired easily now. A walk to the door and back was enough. The porch steps were too much. He stopped asking her to try. One night around 2 in the morning, Daniel woke in the chair to find the cabin completely quiet. Not the alert silence of something about to happen, the deep silence of a house holding its breath. He looked toward Daisy's bed. All 3 cubs were curled around her in a tight, unbroken circle, the fearless one along her back, the cautious one near her feet, the female tucked under her chin, one small paw resting across Daisy's throat. Daisy's eyes were closed. Her breathing was slow and even. Nobody was awake. Nobody was performing anything for anyone. It was just three wild animals lying in the dark around the creature that had kept them alive, keeping her warm the only way they knew how. Daniel sat with that for a long time. He didn't try to name what he was feeling. He'd stopped doing that, somewhere along the way. Some things didn't improve with naming. He thought about Margaret that night, more than he usually let himself. Not with the sharp edge that loss carries in the early years, something softer. He thought about the last autumn she was well enough to sit on the porch, how they'd watched a pair of hawks riding thermals over the eastern ridge for almost an hour without either of them saying much, how she'd reached over at some point and just put her hand on his. No reason, no words. Just that. He thought about how Daisy had sat between them the whole time, white-chinned even then, chin resting on Margaret's knee. He thought about how strangely full a life could become, sometimes, from things you never planned for. The strong day came on a morning in early May. Daniel almost didn't recognize it at first. Daisy was up before him, standing at the door with her ears forward, tail moving slowly, not the vigorous full-body wag of her younger years, but present, intentional. He opened the door without thinking. She walked out onto the porch, down the steps, carefully, one at a time, and out into the cool morning grass. The cubs followed. Daniel pulled on his jacket and followed too, staying well back, not wanting to redirect whatever was happening. Daisy moved through the meadow, at the pace that was comfortable for her now, slow and deliberate, nose working the air, stopping occasionally to stand and look at the tree line. The cubs moved around her in loose orbit, the way they always had, occasionally disappearing into the grass and reappearing 20 feet ahead. She led them, unhurried, into the forest edge. Daniel followed at a distance, stepping carefully, keeping them in sight. The trail she chose was the one they'd walked together 1,000 times during the years when she could cover it at a real pace, past the split birch, down the slow slope to the creek meadow, through the stand of old larches where the light came through differently in the morning, amber and fractured and very still. The cubs seemed to know where she was going before she got there. They ran ahead to the riverbank, the flat rocky shelf where the creek widened and slowed, and the water ran shallow over smooth stone. It was the place Daniel had first started bringing the cubs outdoors, back when they were small enough to fit in his jacket pocket. The place where they'd first felt sun on their faces, where they'd first touched water. Daisy settled herself on the warm flat rock near the water's edge. She put her head down on her paws. The cubs settled around her. Daniel sat on a log back from the bank and didn't move. The creek ran over the stones with that particular sound it made in May, fuller than summer, colder, moving with purpose. A dipper bird worked the far bank. The larches were just starting to soften with new growth at the tips of their branches. It was a long afternoon. The cubs dozed in the sun, and Daisy rested, and Daniel sat on his log and watched the light move across the water, and didn't think about very much at all. She went quietly, the way she had done most things. The cubs were still around her when it happened, the female tucked close under her jaw, the smallest one pressed against her side, the fearless one lying just behind her shoulder with his chin on his paws. Daniel was beside her. He had his hand on her side, feeling her breathe. And then, without drama, without struggle, the breathing simply stopped. The forest stayed exactly the same. The creek kept moving. The dipper was still working the far bank. And in the silence that followed, from somewhere very close, from all three of them at once, came a sound Daniel had never heard before and would never fully be able to describe afterward. Low, sustained, something between a call and a lament. The manals sat with their faces turned slightly upward, making that sound into the still May air, while the creek ran past and the larches stood in the amber light. Daniel stayed where he was. He didn't try to quiet them. He didn't look away. He carried her home as the last light left the sky. The cubs walked the full trail back with him, single file and silent, and sat on the porch while he went inside. He built the fire up higher than he needed to. He set her blanket near the wood stove, in the spot she'd always chosen. He sat in the chair, and sometime in the deep night, he finally slept, the first real sleep he'd had in weeks, heavy and complete, while the fire burned low and the forest outside the cabin was absolutely still. When he woke before dawn and went to the door, the porch was empty. He stepped outside, called softly once. Nothing. He checked the meadow, the forest edge, the trail toward the creek. No movement, no sound. All three of them, gone. He stood in the cold morning air for a long time, looking at the tree line. The cabin behind him was the quietest it had been in 6 months, and the quiet this time was different from any quiet he'd known before. Deeper, emptier, like losing a whole world in a single night. Came without ceremony. Daniel repaired the east fence, filed his patrol reports, restocked the first aid kit, cooked simple meals he didn't particularly taste, and ate them at the kitchen table with the chair across from him empty, the way it had been for years, the way he'd learned to accept. He was good at accepting things. He'd had practice. Daisy's blanket stayed near the wood stove. He told himself he'd wash it, put it away properly. There was no urgency. It wasn't hurting anything where it was. He left it there. The cabin was quiet again. Not the heavy, watchful quiet of those final weeks with Daisy. That silence had its own texture, its own weight, the particular stillness of a house bracing itself. This was lighter than that, cleaner almost, but emptier. There were no paw prints on the kitchen windowsill in the mornings. No ambushes from behind the refrigerator. No small, serious face studying him from across the room as though cataloging his every movement for future reference. He hadn't realized, until it was gone, how much noise 3 small animals could fill a life with. He went through the motions well. He always had. Irina called to check on him twice in June. A colleague from the regional wildlife office stopped by with paperwork and stayed for coffee, and didn't ask too many questions, which Daniel appreciated. He spoke to his daughter in Irkutsk on Sunday evenings, said he was fine, said the summer was shaping up well, said the forest was quiet. He wasn't lying, exactly. The forest was quiet. He found one of the cubs' old toy objects in early July, a short piece of braided rope they'd carried from room to room for weeks during the winter, passing it between them like currency. It had ended up behind the woodpile, and he'd forgotten about it entirely. He held it in his hand for a moment, set it on the mantelpiece, went back to his evening. The weeks stacked up the way weeks do when you've stopped counting them. July became August. The high meadow turned gold. The creek dropped to its summer level, slow and clear over the pale stones. Daniel's morning patrols took on the particular rhythm of late summer, longer light, drier trails. The forest settled into itself the way it got in the stretch before the first frost. He stopped looking at the tree line, not deliberately, just gradually, the way you stop watching a door after enough time passes and nobody comes through it. He told himself this was acceptance. He told himself this was appropriate. He almost believed it. The first snow came in late October, earlier than usual, a fast overnight dusting that left the meadow white and the porch boards frost-covered by morning. Daniel made his coffee, pulled on his jacket and stepped outside to check the temperature gauge on the east post. He stopped on the second porch step. He stood very still. 3 sets of tracks crossed the meadow from the tree line, wide, round prints, the claw marks shallow, the stride long and unhurried. They came across the open ground toward the cabin, circled the porch in a deliberate loop, and then continued to a spot near the south corner where Daisy's old resting place had been, the flattened patch of grass beside the stacked firewood where she used to lie in the sun on warm afternoons. The tracks stopped there, then returned to the tree line. They had come in the night, stood beside the place where Daisy used to rest, and then gone back to wherever they came from. Daniel crouched beside the tracks for a long time, coffee steaming in his hand, reading the story they told in the fresh snow. Then he stood up slowly, went inside, and for the first time in months, sat down at the kitchen table and didn't move for a while. He didn't tell Irina right away. He sat with it for 2 days first, turning it over, applying all the reasonable explanations a man with 30 years in wildlife management would naturally apply. Territory marking, familiar scent trails, the logical behavior of semi-habituated animals returning to a known location, all of it true, all of it correct, none of it quite accounting for the fact that they had stopped specifically at Daisy's spot, that they had stood there, in the dark, on the first night the meadow carried snow, that they had not approached the cabin or the door or any of the other locations that held food associations, just that one spot. He called Irina on the 3rd day. She was quiet for a moment after he finished describing it. Then she said, "Don't move anything near that spot, Daniel. See what happens next." What happened next took 2 more weeks. On a clear, cold evening in early November, Daniel was sitting on the porch with his second coffee watching the last of the light leave the eastern ridge when movement appeared at the tree line. He set his cup down very slowly. 3 shapes at the meadow's edge, low and wide and unhurried. They sat at the border of the tree line and looked at the cabin with those flat, ancient, utterly composed faces, fully grown now. The winter coats had come in thick, long, dense fur, the pattern more pronounced than he remembered, the ruffs around their faces giving them that wide leonine look unique to their species. They were magnificent in the way that wild things are magnificent when they've grown completely into themselves. They sat for a long time just looking. Daniel sat for a long time just looking back. Then Boulder, he knew it was Boulder, because of course it was, stood up, crossed the meadow at a slow, deliberate walk, came directly to the porch steps, and sat down at the bottom of them, and looked up at Daniel with an expression that communicated, with perfect Pallas's cat clarity, absolutely nothing sentimental whatsoever. Daniel laughed, a real one, short and surprised, the kind that comes before you can decide whether to allow it. "Hello," he said quietly. The other two crossed the meadow and settled on the lower step beside their brother. Nobody moved for a long time. The cold came down off the ridge and the stars appeared one by one above the larches, and the three wild cats sat on the porch steps of a mountain cabin like they had every right to be exactly where they were. They didn't stay the night that first visit. An hour, maybe slightly more, and then they rose together and went back across the meadow and into the trees without ceremony. But they came back. That was the thing. 4 days later, tracks in new snow again. A week after that, all three at the meadow's edge in the early evening. Then a visit where Boulder came all the way up to the porch and investigated the woodpile with the same methodical thoroughness he'd applied to everything since cubhood. The cautious one, the observer, the catalogue, began sitting closer each time, never rushing, building something precise and internal that operated on his own timeline and nobody else's. The female stayed a little further back most visits, but she watched the cabin with an attention that was different from the others, more specific, like she was looking for something in particular that she hadn't located yet. In December, Daniel found the first gift, a rabbit, cleanly taken, left on the flat stone beside the south corner of the cabin, beside Daisy's spot. He stood looking at it for a moment in the early light, then went inside and got his notebook and wrote down the date, the location, the condition of the rabbit, the wildlife researcher in him documenting it properly, the rest of him not quite ready to write down what it felt like. More came over the weeks that followed, not always rabbits. Once a ptarmigan, once a small collection of objects, a piece of bark stripped in an interesting pattern, 2 smooth creek stones, a fragment of something he couldn't identify, left in a loose arrangement beside the south corner like items placed with intention. Irina drove out in January and crouched over the arrangement for a long time without speaking. Then she took photographs and measurements and wrote notes in her field book and said she was going to be very careful about how she wrote this up because she wasn't entirely sure what language existed in the literature for what she was looking at. "What are they doing?" Daniel asked. She looked at him over her field book. "I think they're maintaining a relationship," she said, "with this place, with you, with," she paused, "with whatever she meant to them." The winter visits became a rhythm, every few days through the cold months, sometimes more. They moved freely around the property, investigating the woodpile, tracking the bird activity near the east window from outside, occasionally sitting on the porch roof in the early mornings in a way Daniel discovered only because of the sounds overhead and the evidence in the snow. They never fully came inside again. That threshold, once crossed back in the other direction, seemed to hold, but they treated the cabin as theirs in every way that stopped just short of it. He learned to leave the porch light on. He learned that Boulder had strong opinions about being looked at directly for too long. He learned that the cautious one would, after many patient visits, accept a piece of dried meat from Daniel's open palm if Daniel sat on the bottom step and looked at the middle distance and pretended not to notice what was happening. He learned that the female came most reliably in the early evening, just at last light, and that she always paused at Daisy's spot before doing anything else. Every time, without exception, spring came and they disappeared into the mountains the way Irina had always said they would. Daniel's mornings went back to coffee and patrol and fence repair and the long quiet evenings, but it was a different quiet now. It had a shape to it, a defined edge, the quiet of a house between visits rather than the quiet of a house that has forgotten what visitors feel like. He noticed the difference. The following winter they came back, and the winter after that, and the one after that, every year without exception. Every year a little different, the boundaries shifting incrementally, the trust building in the slow accretion of 100 small unremarkable moments. The cautious one eventually sat on the bottom porch step without Daniel having to pretend not to notice. Boulder, to no one's surprise, eventually pushed every established boundary at least once just to see what would happen. The female kept returning to Daisy's spot, every visit, every year, as regular as the season itself. One evening in the fourth winter, Daniel was sitting by the wood stove going through an old box of photographs he'd been meaning to sort. Margaret in the early years, the cabin half built behind her, squinting into summer sun. Daisy as a young dog, unrecognizable in her vigor, launching herself into the creek on what must have been a warm day. The three cubs in their first weeks, unbelievably small, the whole world visible in their enormous frightened eyes. He set that one on the mantelpiece beside the braided rope. Then he took Daisy's old collar from the hook by the door, worn leather, the brass ring gone green, and set it on the hearthstone near the warmth. He didn't know exactly why, it just seemed right. He went to bed. In the morning, before he'd touched the coffee, something made him stop in the doorway between the bedroom and the main room. The female was inside. She had come through the window he'd left cracked overnight. She'd done it once before, months ago, had spooked herself and left immediately. This time she hadn't spooked. She was curled on the hearthstone, on the warm flat stone directly beside the old collar. Her eyes were half closed. Her breathing was slow and even. She was lying in exactly the place Daisy had always chosen. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long time without moving. Then he went to the kitchen, made his coffee, and came back and sat in the old wooden chair. And the morning came in through the east window the way it always did, slow and pale and without ceremony, while outside the snow fell softly on the mountain, and the forest stood in the deep winter quiet, and inside the cabin a wild Pallas's cat slept on the warm hearthstone beside a worn leather collar, in the place where an old Labrador used to rest, as though she had always belonged there, as though she had simply come home. People said wild mammals would forget the dog that raised them once they returned to the wilderness, but even years later, they still came home looking for their mother.